Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our quick workshop today. On today's agenda, hopefully in 40 minutes, we're going to give you a brief but actionable overview of how to back up your security decisions with relevant data. Without further ado, please let me introduce Mr. Rubi Aharoni to lead this workshop. Rubi, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, so I'll start with a personal introduction, talking a little bit about myself and Cye, and then we'll go directly to the point. So as presented, I'm Reuven Aronashvili. I'm the founder and the CEO of Cye Security. My background started in the Israeli army. I was in the founding team of the Israeli Red Team, served for 7 years in the army, and then 2012 I decided to continue to a more civilian career path, I would say. And then decided to found Cye in 2012. Since then, we partnered and served multiple customers worldwide. You can see just a handful of some examples in this screen specifically. Cye is growing very rapidly and serving different geolocations in different industries and very, I would say, diverse type of customers. From this data and this specific access that we have to our decision makers in the organizations that we are working with, we came up with a trend that we found as, I would say, interesting on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, concerning, because we think that the fact that cybersecurity budgets are continuously increasing, that's something that we see almost everywhere. And on the same time, the fact that we see that cybersecurity maturity level in different organizations, best case scenario is not changing, worst case scenario is really decreasing. That's something that should be taken into consideration. We try to analyze the reasons for that and the root causes for that, and we got into several conclusions which we are going to present today as part of our research. The first concept that I would like to maybe emphasize here is what we call compliance-driven cybersecurity maturity programs. While compliance, from our point of view, is a very important topic, right? There are different reasons why to do that. It's definitely an interesting, let's say, way to look at the cybersecurity risk. However, it's definitely insufficient. We see that the compliance-driven approach, something that provides a concept of one suits fit all to different organizations, which is definitely not good enough to cover those specific or unique, let's say, cybersecurity risks or threats that are relevant to different organizations. To take it one level deeper even, we believe that the concept of, and this is something that we hear quite a lot, let's build the cybersecurity maturity into the organization, have something that is steady, and then based on that, we'll start with some kind of evaluation, whether it's security testing, risk profiling, and so on, in order to identify what is the maturity level post-investment. That is something that, from our point of view, is really a wrong way to look at the situation. When you go to the doctor, you don't start with taking the medicines, right? And then after you're going to try and identify what is the specific sickness that you have, right? So diagnostics and understanding the problem, that's a key item in order to identify how to mitigate or to deal with that in order to build a resilience program in the organization. So what we are trying to do is really to change the paradigm of cybersecurity maturity in the specific cybersecurity programs that are being built in the organization. Instead of starting with a template or compliance-driven approach and then test it in the end of the process, we want to change it and do it the other way around. Let's start with identifying where are the gaps, where are the weaknesses, plan around that, set the targets, and then optimize the way that we actually build a cybersecurity program to make sure that we are covering the relevant risks, being able to deal with the relevant threats, or the threat landscape that is continuously growing, as you all know, and of course, based on that, to continuously make sure that the cybersecurity maturity is increasing, the budget that is invested, we can always justify how and when this was and where this was invested, and what is really the ROI, which is a term that is very difficult to speak about when you talk about cybersecurity. What is ROI? But still, that's something that I think is very important to discuss as part of the process in order to make sure that the decision makers in the organization first, they understand the investment, they understand the relevant risk that the organization has and managed to reduce, and above all, what is the resiliency level that the organization managed to achieve. So let's talk about how we do that. And here we are going to go to a very actionable concept. Of course, if you want to dive in more, if you want to get more data, feel free to contact us, as this is a very short session. I would love to provide more details on how to do that, as we believe this is a very actionable way of working. We constructed a 4 stages or phases type of cybersecurity program planning or building. The first one starts with the very basic concept of threat modeling. We'll talk about it. We'll see in a second how we do that. Second part will be measuring the security baseline. That means what are the gaps, what are the weaknesses, what are the vulnerabilities, how those are connected together, what is the organizational risk profile, and above all, how do we quantify the risk on that part. Based on that, we will set the objectives or on when the organization needs to be, right, from cybersecurity standpoint. That's a very difficult question if you think about it. Right? What is the right level of cybersecurity investment, or what is the right level of cybersecurity maturity? That's something that is not very easy to answer, but we'll show you how we do that. And to finalize, of course, you need to implement the program itself and continuously measure as you go. So those 4 steps, those are the steps that we are going to show you now. The mathematical model that we are going to use is based on graph theory. To the ones that are familiar with us, they know that we love the mathematical model that we are going to show here. This is a very practical and useful tool, so we are going to present it and show how we use it. But of course, specific implementation per organization, that's something that can be quite easily achieved. First phase is identifying the 2 sides of the graph. The first side, the left side, will be the potential threat sources for the organization. There are multiple options here, but if you take a closer look, you'll see that the list is final, contained, and you can definitely identify those potential threat sources and prioritize those based on your understanding of the organizational risk. Second part of the graph that we see here, which usually it's a little bit a more, I would say, difficult question. Those are the crown jewels of the business assets or critical business assets that the organization has. In other words, when you come with cybersecurity program, what do you want to protect? Simple question. The answer is a little bit more difficult. However, that's an essential part of building a cybersecurity program in an organization. Here, the concept is really to stay at the business level, so it doesn't have to be a technical analysis, a very high-level business-oriented way of thinking. For example, financial loss, financial fraud, operational continuity, safety, intellectual property, privacy, reputational damage, all of those things that you know that if going to happen in your organization, the consequences to the organization would be significant, dramatic, or fatal. All of those items, of course, need to be taken into consideration and prioritized based either on the importance level or based on the cost associated with each and every one of those items. Second part, measuring the security baseline. There are multiple ways to do that, starting from risk evaluation, exercises of going through risk profiling, penetration testing, red team exercises, purple team exercises. In the end of the process, what we are trying to understand here is what kind of threat source is able to get access to what business critical assets or crown jewel. What will be the way to achieve that? And maybe most important is how those items, those vulnerabilities or weaknesses or gaps are connected together to actually draw a specific risk map of the organization. Here, there are multiple organizations in the world that are able to provide this kind of, let's say, assessment, whether that's, as I said, penetration testing, red team exercise, or whatever. The only thing that needs to be emphasized here is that the context, how things are connected together, is very important to make decisions, data-driven decisions, as we are going to see in a second. Then once this one was identified, the next thing that we will evaluate will be the likelihood for each and every one of the vulnerabilities to be achieved. Achieved meaning identified and exploited. Now, it's a very important topic here that we are discussing, so I want to emphasize 2 points. First, the fact that the specific auditing team or assessing team was able to identify the vulnerability and exploit it, that's a very important part of the process. However, when we try to quantify the effort, skill, and investment required by the attacker to identify and exploit this vulnerability, we will get to a number that will try in a way to reflect this specific effort. There are very complicated ways to do that, and some simplified, let's say, scoring systems that we can, if that's interesting, we can introduce and show how we can do that both in the very sophisticated, accurate way or something that is, let's say, good enough to start with. But my point in this case is that every organization is able to do that, at least on a basic level, to get a feeling, an understanding of how this threat landscape and organizational risk is actually presented or exposed in this specific visual representation that you see here. Now, one thing that I would emphasize at this point is that part of the paradigm shift that we are doing is we are changing the view from looking at a specific vulnerability to try and evaluate attack routes, complete attack routes. The reason for that is that we have a starting point, we have an end point where we end the attack specific, we have a calculated likelihood for that. And when we talk about mitigation, the important thing from our point of view is to actually eliminate attack routes rather than eliminate vulnerabilities. That means if a vulnerability is mitigated and the attack route still exists, that is not really interesting from our point of view. But if there are vulnerabilities that still exist, but the attack route is eliminated because we disconnected the most critical routes or most critical edges on the specific route, that from our point of view will be the required result. Taking it to the next point, right? We have now, we've created the threat model, we've analyzed the organization, we got an understanding of the organizational risk, a very technical evaluation of what happens when, what business critical assets are under risk, and what is the likelihood or calculated likelihood per attack route to be achieved. Now we are going to the next level. There are multiple, let's say, standards in the market to calculate cybersecurity maturity level. One of them is CMMI, second is CMMC. Those are very similar concepts to evaluate cybersecurity maturity on a scale of 0 to 5. In those specific standards, usually a full, let's say, organizational maturity level is being calculated. We take a different approach here and actually separate or segregate the different cybersecurity domains in the organization into different topics, trying to evaluate those topics one by one in order to generate the objective or the to-be state of the organization to really be able to identify what needs to be done in what effort level, and that will lead very, let's say, significantly the decision-making that we'll do in the fourth stage and in the implementation process that we'll do in a second. So what you see here is really the maturity level that we were able to calculate per security domain. The security domain starts from the most strategic, governance-oriented concepts like policies, procedures, strategy, and so on. Going through security operations, that means detection and response capabilities, network level security, endpoint level security, application level security, sensitive data, private information, identity management. In some organizations that is relevant, we have the cloud level security, OT related security, IoT related security, and so on and so forth. Based on those capabilities or based on those specific security domains, we measure the maturity level of the organization and then benchmark it against the industry, the geolocation, and the size of the organization in order to understand where are the peers or the other organizations in the same domain actually are from cybersecurity maturity level. Now, when you see this comparison, there are two things that we take into consideration. First item is what we call the viral noise, right? We calculate the viral noise meaning attacks that are not trying to target a specific organization, but actually have some kind of concept, technique, vulnerability, or exploit that is widely spreaded. Usually when you have a new zero day or something similar, that's something that is quite common to see. There are multiple phishing campaigns that are continuously running and so on and so forth. Those items are called the viral noise. First thing that we need to do is to get above the viral noise. The second thing usually comes together in most organizations, it is to be above the, or let's say, the benchmark level. And that's a very important way of looking at things. It's very easy to say, hey, every organization should be at maturity level 5, right? Saying that it's very easy, achieving that, that's a totally different story. So, of course, we want to balance the cybersecurity investment and the cybersecurity efforts into the organizational needs or with the organizational needs. And that's something that is really presented in this specific concept that you see here. So at every point when we identify that the organization is at the lower maturity level than the average or benchmark in the industry, we take the industry, we add a standard deviation to be above one standard deviation compared to the average of the maturity level that we've identified, and this will be the target of the maturity level that we are going to derive for the organization. This is then being translated into actionable cybersecurity projects. That's something that is correlated. I mean, the maturity level is usually correlated to capabilities that the organization needs to be able to implement. And based on that, the target plan is being evaluated. So just to quickly summarize until this point, started with threat modeling. We've done a very comprehensive security assessment to identify the organizational risk. Based on the results, we measure the maturity level of each and every one of the security domains, set up the specific targets, the objectives, the to-be state, and now we are going to the implementation phase. So the translation process that I've discussed from those specific maturity items into actionable projects, this is what we are going to show now. So working with this specific structure that you see here, other than the fact that it's a visual representation of, let's say, the identified vulnerabilities, we also created here a mathematical structure that provides quite a lot of data items that we can analyze. One of them, as you remember, was the likelihood per exploitation. Based on this likelihood, we are able to calculate the most probable attack routes, or actually prioritize all the attack routes based on their likelihood to happen. So the first one will be the most likely one. In this case, you can see, for example, the one that we've calculated in this simple graph. Now, when we identify this specific route, just to remind you, as I said, the objective now will be to disconnect this specific attack route by identifying the optimal edge to mitigate. Optimal meaning minimal cost while reducing the same risk, which is the disconnection of this specific attack route. So in this case, it's very simple. You have two vulnerabilities. The things that are with the dashed line, that means a capability, so something that cannot be mitigated by a given situation by the location that you are. So from those two specific vulnerabilities, it's very easy to identify which one will be easier or cheaper to mitigate. And based on that, you are able to make a decision, disconnect this one, and go again and calculate the next one that needs to be then taken into consideration. Using this iterative process, you are able actually to prioritize all the vulnerabilities that were identified, and the vulnerability is then translated into a mitigation project that will complete the specific need for maturity level improvement that we've discussed before. So just to make it very clear, right? Every decision that we make here, we know very specifically why we are going to do or to implement this specific mitigation project or cybersecurity improvement project, whatever you want to call it, because we see the specific impact of this specific vulnerability that was translated to a mitigation project. And then we know how to emphasize, calculate, and quantify the specific risk reduction that was associated with this specific attack. When you do that iteratively, that's something that can provide a very clear mathematical evaluation for the cybersecurity risk of the organization, the cost of potential damage to the organization, and of course, the cost for mitigation that is associated with the plan that we are going now to develop. This way, and the outcome of the entire process should be taking all the buzzwords or headache or chaotic situation that a CISO usually sees, right? Because there are multiple needs, multiple capabilities that the organization needs, right? You have endpoint protection, and you have security operations, and you have password policy and DLP, and multi-factor authentication, container security, and cloud security, and so on. What is more important? That is the question. And based on this process, we are putting that in a very clear order. This is first priority. This is really, those are the projects that need to be implemented. This is the cost associated with each and every one of those. That's a work that still needs to be done with the organization to understand the cost per item. And then this is also the associated risk reduction, because that's something that we can then calculate based on the likelihoods that we've introduced before to each and every one of those specific projects. In this specific order, you know specifically what you want to achieve, you know how a specific project will contribute to the maturity level evaluation of your organization in a specific security domain, and based on that, you're able to provide a very clear, measurable process to the organization, to the decision makers. And of course, when you do that continuously, you're able to continuously reprioritize things, because again, threat landscape is changing. The attackers are becoming more sophisticated, different threats coming every now and then. And of course, the organization itself is dynamic. So everything that we discussed here, if you do that one time, that's not good enough. If you do that every year, that's still not good enough. The frequency or the specific timing, that's something that can be calculated per organization, what is the right time. But generally speaking, the continuous approach, the continuous concept of cybersecurity improvement, that's something that every organization should adopt as a basic requirement from the cybersecurity team. The way that we see that, when we talk about continuous effort, we usually take the steps that we've discussed from the first step to the last step and do that every time again. So you don't need to start from scratch every time. However, making sure, validating that the threat model that you had at the beginning is still valid, and then that the vulnerabilities that were identified are still relevant, and there are no new vulnerabilities, and then quantification of the maturity level, because maturity level can also decrease, not only increase, based on different things that are happening in the threat landscape and in the market in general. All of those items need to be taken into consideration as a project, as a specific concept that you are going to introduce in the organization over and over and over again to continuously improve the cybersecurity maturity level, and at some point to maintain the cybersecurity maturity level, which is not an easier task to be very open here, right? So even if you reach the target cybersecurity maturity level, it doesn't mean that you can rest and say, okay, we are good, we can stop at cybersecurity. Unfortunately, that's not the situation. Just to summarize the concept that we've introduced, right? We want to take an approach that is data-driven and fact-driven to take a cybersecurity plan from something that is compliance-driven, or let's say the very traditional way of working based on ISMS kind of frameworks, to something that is much more effective, tailored, and in the way actionable for a specific organization. The things that we want to change one by one, instead of validating the program in the end of the process, make the validation process actually the decision-making tool. Change the order. Start with identifying the gaps and then tailor the solution and not vice versa. Second item, simulators are very nice for control validation. When you want to identify the specific gaps and weaknesses that you have in your organization, you need to use, emphasize, and introduce capabilities that are actually mimicking actual attackers. That means no assumptions, trying to work as actual attackers and provide very actionable, clear results into what were the vulnerabilities and how those should be mitigated. Then, instead of thinking in vulnerability level, start thinking attack outs level. So again, mitigating a vulnerability from our point of view can be useless if the attack route is still relevant and still existing. The other way around is the way that we prefer. Disconnect the attack route, then deal with the remaining vulnerabilities. That's the right way to do that. And in the end of the process, everything that we do, we don't understand the business context, if we are not able to quantify the consequences or the impact to the business, we won't be able to justify what I started by saying, the ROI of cybersecurity. ROI of cybersecurity can be only calculated when you understand the business impact, the business risk, and then the contribution of the cybersecurity program to reduction of the business risk in general. I'll bring the discussion back to Morley. Of course, I'll be more than happy to answer the relevant questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruby. Just before we get to the Q&A, I want to show the poll results from earlier. We'll just give this a quick view. So we have a tie between which data sources are driving your decision making in your program, between industry frameworks like NIST, for example, between security assessment reports, pen testing, red teaming. I wonder if we would redo the poll, would it change? I don't know. I'm just going to hide that, and I'll send it to you later. Okay, so we've got a few questions, and as I remind everyone, we decided this was going to be a quick workshop instead of those 2-3 hour webinars where people fall asleep in the middle. What we've got here is more questions. Hopefully we'll get to all of them. Let's start off. So Ruby, we have someone asked, there is a prevailing opinion that cybersecurity risks and resulted losses are increasing. Can the evolution of cybersecurity threats be estimated, and if so, to what degree?
So that's a very interesting question. So I think that in general, we see that when trying to quantify the cost of breach in different organizations, we see that the attackers are starting to push, let's say, the right places, the right pressure places, let's say, in order to increase the extortion capabilities and in general the cybersecurity cost for specific breaches. So I think that with the evolvement of the standard in the market, right, like what is the requirement for a specific, let's say, what is the amount of funds that are being required in a case of ransomware attack, and then the double extortion concept of ransomware and then data leakage and so on. I think that in general, the predictive model can definitely be able to anticipate the magnitude of let's say the financial loss that is expected for an organization. However, the specific let's say coverage or the scope of the number, let's say, of organizations that are going to suffer on those specific attacks, that's something that is very hard to quantify. We see insurance companies are really struggling with the point, right, on how to be able to identify or quantify the specific risk. But I think that on an organizational level, in a specific organization, that's something that can definitely be identified, predicted, and in a way estimated quite accurately, I would say, with not huge standard deviation there. But when you talk industry-wide, that's a totally different question and very hard to quantify.
Okay, we have another question. I think, but this couldn't be something that people deal with because I'm sure everyone gets their board's full support and budget whenever they want. So the question here is, how do you get leadership to understand you don't have enough budget for a program?
That's a great question and really directly relates to what we've discussed earlier. I think that once you're able to quantify the business impact, right, and you can show a direct correlation to the cybersecurity lack of investment, or if we take it to the positive part, if you invest in cybersecurity, what will be the risk reduction or the expected loss reduction that you get from this specific security program, I think it's very convincing. So if you put numbers in front of a board of directors, when they are personally accountable for the results or impact of cybersecurity attacks, I think that will be an easier discussion when they see that you have an X amount of millions of dollars, right, that are at risk. And if you invest 5%, then you are able to reduce 50% of the risk. Then that's something, I mean, decision making becomes very easy. Of course, if you are asking for 200% of the potential loss, then it doesn't make sense, and something needs to change in the cybersecurity program that you've developed. But that's the whole point, sorry, of the quantification process that we are doing here. Put the specific requirements, the budget requirements in front of the potential loss, and then it's a very easy decision to technical team members, of course, and also to non-technical team members that or board of directors or executives that look at the numbers and see the decision-making process becomes much easier based on the numbers.
Yeah, and I guess it always helps if there's some kind of visualize, like to see it visually in front of you. So like reading a book with more pictures. We have a question here about disruption. So running a live attack instead of an attack simulator can cause outage to the production environment. How can the outage or service disruption be prevented while running live attacks?
That's a great question. I think that when you compare, let's say, automated tools, right, and manual capabilities, first of all, I would say that automated tools are much more likely to cause damage in this kind of sensitive environments when you talk about the OT, SCADA-related environments, and so on. I'm not saying that automated tools are forbidden. I'm just saying that they need to be treated with a little bit of care. And like everything else in life, right? You wouldn't take a doctor to take you to the OR, right? And make a very complex surgery on you without having the right credentials. Same needs to be done when you talk about cybersecurity teams, right? You need to take professionals, people that have the relevant credibility, and of course, some kind of guarantee that they are not going to harm any kind of or create any kind of downtime. Now, I can talk from our own experience. We have very specific controls and balances to make sure that no damage would be introduced to the organization, because we quantify each and every one of the tests that we want to do and put a risk factor per item, right? And everything that is above a threshold would not be executed in live environment unless we have a specific approval for that, or more than that, I would say a specific environment that we can actually try to do that without harming the organization. But again, that's really a skill kind of question. And if you have the right skills, the right experience, then you are able to do that in a very accurate way without any impact to the systems and to the organization, of course.
Okay, that was asked by Ellie, so I hope that answered your question. Ruby, we have one more question, time for one more question. By the way, whoever sent a question in and did not get an answer here, I personally will make sure, I will hunt down Ruby and make sure that you get emailed his answer. So to finish it off, this is pretty relevant. This was a very interesting presentation, but how can I implement this process in my company?
Okay, that's a very fair question. So there are 4 stages, right, to what I've just introduced. The first stage, the specific threat modeling, it's quite straightforward. Again, there are threat sources, list of threat sources that you can find everywhere, but in general, we talk about different types of external attackers, different types of internal attackers, and different types of partner supply chain related organizations. On the right side, Then you have the business critical assets. That's an organizational question that has to be answered in any case. Otherwise, you're just wasting money if you don't know what you want to protect. In the second phase, this is, from my point of view, the most complicated one maybe to achieve, or the most skill required in this specific part. This is the actual assessment. Right there, you can use either internal capabilities of red teaming or risk officers in the organization, or alternatively to use a third party supporting with a pen test or red team exercise. Then when it comes to decision making, quantifying the specific risk, here there are different models that can be taken into consideration. For example, when you talk about quantification of likelihood per vulnerability. So yeah, you can have a very sophisticated AI-based, statistical sampling-based algorithm that will identify this number for you. However, you can use something that is much more simplified, and that's, for example, calculating just the exposure level, the opportunity for the attacker, and some kind of estimation to the, let's say, skill level required by the attacker to really exploit this specific vulnerability. And there are very simple steps to do that, right? Once you have that, I think that the rest of the process is quite straightforward, because this is the key for it. So implementing those, again, threat models, then pen test red team exercise to get the results. And on top of that, you have the quantification, that means the specific likelihood per item on the attack graph that we've demonstrated before. That should provide you with the framework that you need to actually go through the entire process without any kind of issue.
Okay. Well, yeah, well, that's all we have time for in the Q&A right now. Mike, Peter, Boris, and a few others that are sending the messages right now, I will make sure you get an answer to your questions by tomorrow. Rubi, thank you so much for that quick and to the point, excellent presentation. We'll just one more click and we'll show you where you can reach us if you have anything that you need from the future. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. This was very good, straight to the point, as we said. And we'll see you next time when we do something of this sort. We'll let you know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.